present him adequately. Also, Mark has a number of lives, so basically I will refer to the ones I know the best. I would say he's basically one of the teachers I value the most in the school. You've been able to see the seminars he's actually teaching. You had the chance of seeing 2 presentations, even though he's giving one, and you can actually see the breadth of scope, the scope basically of the investigations he tackles. And I would also claim without hesitation that basically he's one of the best studio critics I've seen, and unfortunately, had it not been for the Venice Art Biennale, you would have actually had the chance to witness that during the summer. And indeed, talking about the Venice Biennale, one way of presenting Mark would be to claim that basically he has actually been working on the overlaps between the arts and architecture for quite some time. Although that's an extremely general comment to make, and I'll make another one which is equally general, which is that he's also been dealing with questions of curating architecture as the director of the exhibitions at Columbia, where he's been curating some exhibitions and also conducting the project of the Living Archive. Still, that doesn't reduce the work too clearly, and indeed, I can actually claim with a certain joy that even though I've known Mark for quite some time, I cannot anticipate exactly what he's going to lecture on tonight. So I'm actually looking forward to this extremely much. Mark.
Thanks for coming out, and thank you, Enrique, for inviting me to talk and for your introduction. And it's not a surprise that you don't know what I'm talking about, but let me just say that I feel that I've kind of naively fallen into a trap. Enrique asked those of us teaching seminars this summer to not present papers, but to present some other type of work. And so, sorry, is that better? And so, rather naively, I've taken up that challenge, and I'm presenting work which is radically underdeveloped and in process, and are essentially field notes from a project that I am currently working on. The project is called House Arrest, and the title emerges, and this project indeed emerges from an interest in atmospheres, which is roughly related to the seminar that some of you saw me present. And this interest in atmospheres is something that finds its way into a series of, I'm not sure what to call them, research projects that I'm undertaking with a partner in Los Angeles. And with that partner, I have this entity called IHA, the International House of Architecture. But importantly, let me say that while this project, House Arrest, which I will describe in a minute, is thematically and geographically focused in Los Angeles, this set of projects also emerges from an interest in archives, and Enrique already indicated that I was involved in the Living Archive project at Columbia, but I have my own particular and perverse interests in archives, the status of archival work, and the legitimacy and illegitimacy of the selection, manipulation, and organization of archival material. In part, this comes down to the way in which claims of knowledge, expertise, and disciplinary position are made within architecture. This always starts somewhere with an archive and with the deployment of that archive. And so these projects that I've been working on under IHA are not exactly intended to reverse or undermine the claim of the power of the archive, but let's say they are intended to open the archive to a different set of manipulations than might be normally performed. This project, House Arrest, is sponsored by a Graham Foundation for Arts and Architecture grant, and so I owe them great thanks for helping us get underway with this project. There are several aspects to the project, and as I said today, I will show some of the beginnings of this project, and this project, which form a network of readings of marijuana grow house operations in Southern California. And These marijuana grow house operations in California interest us for several reasons, but primarily with a set of cliches, which I will begin to enumerate. For example, there is a familiar narrative of the San Fernando Valley, and it holds the repetitiveness of this vast suburbia in Los Angeles, is producing an image of social conformity, and it simultaneously provides cover for aberrant activities. From the alcoholic, adulterous families of The Graduate, 1967 film, to those more recently depicted in the fictional TV show Weeds, the agrestic suburb, Angelino suburb, the valley is frequently employed to confirm this repression model of architecture. Thus, in the valley, repetition and typology is understood to correspond both to social conformity and a return of the repressed, most familiarly in the pornographic film industry. Over the past decade, however, this narrative of conventional domestic behavior and clandestine activities has increasingly described another architectural variant, the marijuana grow house. In these radically altered valley houses, the familiar trappings of the single-family dwelling surround the technical operations and mechanisms of indoor cultivation. As demand in Southern California for hydroponic marijuana has increased, these operations have brought the production source closer to the consumer. Cultivators who buy property also take advantage of local housing market shifts, as well as of the generous interior spaces associated with a single-family dwelling type. Along with the profits generated by joining crop yields to suburban real estate values, other economies proliferate through and around grow houses. Perhaps most important is the economy of concealment and detection. High-intensity lamps used for hydroponic cultivation produce heat signatures perceptible by helicopter-mounted thermal imaging cameras. In response, grow house owners invest in elaborate insulation methods and hyper-efficient building envelopes to conceal and limit their heat spillage. Thus, a form of image warfare is waged around grow houses that escalates consideration of suburban appearance past issues of social conformity to questions of architecture and criminality. Through this escalation, the grow house is positioned at the juncture of several sensitive contemporary political and spatial discourses, including the obvious ones of domestic surveillance, data ownership, and telephone tapping, and for us raises novel considerations of something we're calling energy privacy. So these photos are taken a year ago in Chino. Chino is in the Inland Empire near Los Angeles. And the area around Chino has become the source for the most valuable and potent marijuana grown in California. The knowledge of these grow operations is made available to us first through the production of a certain type of arrest imagery. Typically, as grow operations are discovered, the houses are eviscerated, emptied, and exposed as criminal, which is what you're seeing here. This is a shot of one of the interior wiring systems of a conventional grow house in Chino. So typically, as grow operations are discovered, the houses are eviscerated, emptied, and exposed as criminal. These images are then disseminated through websites such as that of the Drug Enforcement Agency, local newspaper reporting, etc. Important to this set of documents is a conventional practice of marijuana perp walking, in which the marijuana, as you see here, is exposed or becomes an object of exposure. One of the oddities of this form of representation is that the operation owner is rarely arrested or on site, so there's a compensatory theatrical display of the criminality of the house itself and the criminal attributes of the marijuana plant. And so we see that being perfectly staged here in this recent arrest in Chino. And we see this operation in which the local police agencies bring up the marijuana plants and stage them in front of the house for the photo. And this photograph is actually an oddity, as I explained, because the occupant of the house is actually arrested, which almost precisely never happens, thus the compensatory nature of the images. And so this is a diagram of something we're called the arrest system, and it attempts to show a link of several stages of the arrest operation. So first and most importantly is the discovery of the grow house, and this is produced and performed with advanced imaging techniques, And as helicopters equipped with advanced infrared thermal imaging cameras scan neighborhoods, sites for marijuana grow operations are discovered or discerned or guessed at. Secondly is the arrest of the house, in which drug enforcement and state and country police force agents storm the house. And third, in which the marijuana plants are removed from the house and the emergence of the contents of the house is photographed in this theatrical operation we have seen and disseminated, distributed among websites, newspapers, and most importantly, the Drug Enforcement Agency's own website. So left behind after the drug arrest system and this set of quasi-theatrical procedures are houses in their state of aftershock disembowelment and mutilation. One of the common narratives told about the grow house is that the operation has left the house not only utterly transformed past the point of domestic utility, but also contaminated. Thus the house is left in its state of abject ruination, even as the exterior remains more or less undisturbed, as it would still appear on the market. And these are shots of a house in the Inland Empire, taken recently after the arrest sequence. And you see something about the elaborate interior renovation of the house to prepare them for the operations, and you see something about the not only the aesthetics of the grow house operation, but the aesthetics of the arrest system and its aftermath, let's say. And you see the strange conjunction of the grow house system and the remnants of domesticity within the panda bear wallpaper, etc. And so through a protracted set of interviews with the DEA, the LA and Riverside County Sheriffs, and the LA Police Department, we were eventually allowed access to a series of data sets that allowed us to locate recent sites of grow house arrest. These revealed a clustering of operations in the Norco Corona area, and Norco and Corona, of course, are probably known to you because they participated emphatically in the well-known expansion zone of subprime housing. And there's a close correlation, obviously, between the exploitation of these homes in the Inland Empire for grow house operations and the turmoil of the subprime housing market. And we'll say more about that in a bit. But most importantly, until recently, this area was used primarily for dairy farming. And these spots in particular are expression of the explosive conversion and subdivision of the agricultural landscape into large-scale tract housing. And so you see some of there's a vast encyclopedia of recent arrests, but this is a compilation of some of the data that was delivered to us specifically by the LAPD. So in trying to come to terms with not only the logic, the economy, the ecology, and the perverse system of representation that constitutes the grow house, we've started to compile a lexicon of terms, the first of which is houseplant. And that houseplant first has to be understood as an inversion of the agricultural landscape into the interior of the house, a kind of internal plantation, retransformation of the domestic house into a production plant. And on the other hand, this houseplant entry is attentive to another set of associations to the post-war houseplant. And there's a kind of undercurrent in this entire project of picking up the prevalence of images of the interior houseplant on the either side of house windows within post-war imagery, or picture windows, and this is common to anybody who has studied post-war architecture, that the plant becomes an agent of the most conventional blurring of the interior and exterior, and the location of the plant in relationship to plants on the outside is not only a staging and a figuration of a certain kind of interior California biological oriented, ecologically oriented domesticity, but the yet another phase in the consolidation of an image of a salubrious Southern California modernism. These images are all taken from Arts and Architecture magazine from between 1949 and 1957, where you see an endless proliferation of this confusion and this staging of the plant as a kind of fetish object for California modernism. So much so, this is the last image we saw was the LACMA exhibition, actually showing the stud wall as climbing apparatus for the interior house plant. And, sorry, but probably the most important of all of these is Ralph Rapson's case study house number 4, which is known as the Greenbelt House, in which the interior becomes a productive agricultural landscape. And so the contemporary grow house not only channels this long history of the houseplant within Southern California modernism, but also exacerbates and changes the terms of the ecology of the grow house. And it's also important to see the grow house in relationship to a slightly more contemporary set of references. This is the vegetable garden house, which is, I would say, a step closer to the contemporary grow house. This is a house project produced by the Italian radical architecture group 9999, in which the Space Electronic site for radical architectural experiments in Florence in the 1960s was transformed into this laboratory for a kind of vegetative interior. And here we see more properly the grow house interior. But while the grow house shares something of the aesthetics of a domestic interior transformed into an agricultural landscape, and carries something of the floral decoration of the Southern California domestic interior, unlike the case study house, where adjacency of the interior plant to the transparent facade is requisite, the condition of the contemporary grow house is and requires the extreme radical invisibility of the interior plant operation, even as I suggest it fulfills some version of the early modernist organic and biologically oriented interior. The question of the appropriate environment is also inverted, whereas the modernist houseplant arguably held a primarily representational or even rhetorical role. The most obvious figure of an ecological environmental adaptability, in the grow house, the signs of domesticity now become necessarily representational. Moreover, function is paramount for the grow house, and to function successfully, the grow house requires, to use the apt ecological vocabulary, a homeostatic balance of light, air, water. The inherent difficulty of maximizing yield within a hermetic seal has placed a performance pressure on the grow house operation, which is exacerbated by the basic illegality of the operation. Hence, a link is formed between the basic practices of environmental control and anti-detection strategies. And so we have a picture here of a basic grow house exterior. And through our study of the grow house collections, we started with a typological analysis. And I will start to demonstrate some of the typology and operations of the grow house. And they're being shown through this single-story mass-produced plan, which has, according to our analysis, the higher probability of a grow house insertion. Its very ubiquity of this type is the condition of its survival. And it's through this ubiquity which the grow house attempts to disappear into a landscape of identical or nearly identical types. It is the notion of the suburb without qualities, the most prevalent cliché applied to the valley, that is tested by the grow house. Indeed, the grow house strategically occupies this cliché as fully as it occupies its host house. The grow house is a covert inhabitant of a repetitive landscape. And so you see something of the basic plan of a typical grow house operation. And here you see the components of the grow house operation in its fully fleshed form. So what I'm showing is an efficient grow house operation. It's a hydroponic system, and this system is the one that most efficiently optimizes the relationship between house volume and yield. The system is known as the nutrient feed tube. The plants are suspended above the tubes, and lights necessary for the maintenance of and for the health of the plants are installed. In this system, which again is typical based on the single-family house in Chino. There are 16 plants per unit, one of these hydroponic units. There are 34 units, a total of 544 plants per cycle. The vegetation state takes 10 days, the flowering takes 50 days, and there's a total of 60 days per cycle, 6 harvests per year, which delivers a yield of 3,264 plants per year, and the total amount of marijuana produced is 204 pounds at a very conservative street estimate, wholesale street price of $280 per ounce. This delivers a gross revenue of $920,000. Sorry, I could go into detail about the nutrient film technique and the cycling of the plants, which is very consequential for the interior organization of the grow house. So if any of you have questions about that, we can return to the technical details. But what we're seeing in this HVAC system is the 2 air supply devices. The one colored blue is the modified original house air system. The second colored green is an additional system which plays a dual role. The lighting system is connected, and which generates a tremendous heat load, and this heat load must be evacuated, and thus it requires its own HVAC system, which is then fed to the house chimney. But as you see in this diagram, connected to the HVAC system, to the blue and the green, are a couple of devices. At the intake, this large object to the right is something called a pollen scrubber that keeps insects and foreign pollen from entering and contaminating the grow farm. The second large unit is a charcoal filter needed to mask the smell of the growing plants. The smell of the ripe cannabis is a familiar indicator of house operations, obviously because there's so much marijuana being grown and it is so potent. And it was precisely around not only the maintenance of the homeostatic balance of the plants that the HVAC systems are in place, but the masking of the smell in the interior operation that requires it. Second entry in the lexicon is the new domestic landscape. So while smell detection is the first of several detection approaches used by the DEA and local drug law enforcement agencies, as the grow house increases the efficiency of its interior enclosure, the techniques are required to become more subtle and more invasive, the detection techniques. In turn, the grow house operators deploy their own counter-detection approaches. Working within this environment of law enforcement and counter-detection, growers have incorporated key components of green construction, in which insulation panels, vapor barriers, thermally reflective mylar are integrated to the grow system, producing not only a strategically and necessarily green architecture, but something like a deeper shade of green architecture. And this warfare is primarily played out through thermographic photography. We understand this in architecture and the construction trade, and thermographic photography is used as one of the primary tools of law enforcement and construction industry. And so what we see is an interesting an almost perfect cross-registration of forms of representation between the criminal identity of the grow house operation and the way the thermographic image is used in the construction trade. And so for those of you not familiar with thermographic imaging, what you're looking at here is an image of a failed plumbing system on the facade of a house. The dark purple stain on the right represents the thermographic signature of the interior of the temperature of the water making itself evident on the exterior of the house. And so an important point about the thermographic camera, for those of you that don't know, is that unlike a conventional camera, the pixel is not a registration of tone, but a unit of thermal measure that indicates very specific heat locations. And so while the thermographic images collect data from the house, this information can be manipulated in many forms other than the way in which we manipulate conventional photography. And so the detection and concealment game plays out in terms of concealing the heat signature, but also plays out in terms of the olfactory image of the house. Around the vents of the grow houses, traces of developing plants are left on the exterior surfaces, and despite the charcoal filter, the plant emits particulate matter that can often escape the filter, and which then leaves a trace of these molecules, and these traces are now more available to detection by olfactory imaging technologies. And what you see here is an image of something called the Easy Nose, which is used to scan neighborhoods in Southern California to pick up the THC signature, this time an olfactory signature, not a heat signature of the house. And it's precisely, again, around the game of the most efficient HVAC filtering system versus the efficiency and sensitivity of the Easy Nose, where the technology warfare of the grow house is played out. And so, along with several other systems of detection, the thermographic signature and the olfactory image indicate a type of information leak that are principal channels of entry into the house for the law enforcement agencies. Which is to say that the law enforcement agencies enter through the information leaking out. And as you can imagine, the legal warfare is played out precisely around this question of whether law enforcement agencies have access to these olfactory images or thermographic images, and it's precisely because of the emanating characteristic of the thermographic image that the law enforcement agencies are allowed access to the house, which is to say that the image of the interior of the house precisely travels past the house to the exterior, staging and making available the interior as a type of public image. And so the double valence of typical construction materials, green architectural components, and the interior wall system compose the distinct growing areas and the grow house ecology. The wall serves as a second type of environmental enclosure, these interior walls, which in itself is composed of several layers of thermal retaining material that has another precise function, which is to stage an appearance of the normative domestic interior compressed into a narrow perimeter zone. And so you see this in this image on the lower left-hand side, that the front of the typical grow house will have a staged zone of conventional domesticity, which is sometimes occupied by the grow house inhabitants, sometimes not. But in some situations, you will have an entirely domesticized perimeter around the grow house factory within the interior. So, third entry into the lexicon is something we call Radiant City. So using the clustering of the data set and using the information made available to us by the various drug enforcement agencies, we began to perform our own grow house detection operation using our own remotely controlled thermographic imaging strategies and something called BAP, balloon aerial photography. And what we're looking at is a map of one location in the Inland Empire called the Elka Road development, which shows recent examples of grow house arrests in the area. Second is an area known as the Shady Tree development, showing the scanning operation that we performed there, and recent arrests in the neighborhood. And so the thermographic camera is connected to this aerial remote-controlled balloon through self-regulating camera suspension system called a Picabet system, which is then aimed at the houses, registering the information leak of various houses in Inland Empire. Here you see a rough section of the operation, and similarly a nighttime drive-by operation in which the camera is attached to the side of the automobile. And here is a collection of some of the thermographic images that we start to collect from our own survey of the zones in which the highest probability of grow house operations are likely to occur. So this is, I'm showing you documentation of
slowly. Let's try to keep it really steady and constant. So let's start walking it. About another like 2 feet.
So this is some of the video footage. So obviously, as I mentioned, these are kind of field notes on a project that is underway. But just let me return to one point, which has to do with the cliche of the notion of the repressed, of the repressed aberrant behavior within the Angelino suburb. But there are a number of other cliches that occupy the grow house economy and ecology. One of the first cliches to interrogate is that this production of images, these thermographic images, is the result of advanced technologies and that they represent an advanced system of detection. In fact, social patterns are the most usual source of detection, and any close study of grow house literature, an unsurprisingly wildly paranoid genre, will quickly reveal that while the grow house is positioned in this low-grade tech warfare, it is really the attitude of the occupants and the relationship to neighbors that will raise suspicion most often. And so the grow house is in fact an inhabitant of a landscape of economic speculation, and it is in the turmoil of this economic and social landscape that it most successfully disguises itself. All of these factors are much more consequential than the image itself or any of the other detection technologies. And yet the not so advanced technological image of the house has an important character, it produces a representation of the house that can claim to reveal something of its hidden interior through a type of surface expression, or let's call it a surface expression, which is to say that the relatively blank facade is made revelatory and expressive through this technique. And while the official discourse avoids a direct citation of 19th century debates on type and criminality, a similar conceptual and forensic operation of making the minor formal differences speak for the interior state or the moral character of the interior is at play, even if here the repetition of the form is an impediment, and it is the repetition, this degree zero of expressivity, that requires a radiant, neo-erratic imagery. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions, technical or otherwise, on grow house operations. Yes. Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, because I guess it depends whether we believe in the results, and so I've only shown you, and I've spared you some of the massive amounts of research we've done on the detection technologies, but the conclusion is that, and this is what I tried to hint at the end, is that the detection techniques actually don't detect anything. I mean, they do, but not really. And in fact, they're a kind of staging of the technological competence of the Drug Enforcement Agency, and they serve a type of rhetorical function within the imaging of this criminalized interior. But we have found no direct proof that the thermographic imaging has actually led to convictions. Nonetheless, what we have been able to do is find that the houses which were scanned thermographically and then later resulted in arrests have produced a type of typological clustering. And this is what we're interested in at this point more than the thermographic images themselves. So the thermographic images are completely fascinating, as I said, for this weird neo-erratic rhetoric attached to them. But in terms of the efficacy of the image, I have a lot of suspicions. Mark. Yeah, well, it's well, as I tried to hint at, you know, they're obviously very complex neighborhoods, and these are all recent developments, and they're all part of the foreclosure landscape. And typically what happens now is that the grow house operations position themselves within the newest neighborhoods. because social patterns of mutual observation, let's call it, have not been well established. And so it's easy to disguise aberrant behavior within an unstable social network. And so what's happened now is that the foreclosures are so intense in these neighborhoods, and people have abandoned so many houses, that in fact the grow house operations are thriving better than ever, because there is no stable form of social observation or mutual detection at play. And in fact, it makes it much easier. Thirdly, the grow house operations are actually serving as a kind of economic anchor for a lot of these neighborhoods right now, which is to say that the more grow house operations, the fewer foreclosures there are. And so they actually operate as, even through the bizarre pantomime of occupation, they actually start to serve as stabilizers of many of these neighborhoods. So it's incredibly complex and interesting, but yes, we spoke to many of these people, and of course there's always an expression of shock and surprise, and then they will gleefully show you the residue and remnants and detritus of one of the arrests. And so it's actually a pretty common occurrence in these neighborhoods. Right, which raises again the cliche of the inhabitation of not only a repetitive suburb, but a repetitive suburb that has this mythology of repressed aberrant behavior, right? It's a kind of confirmation of the fantasy, let's say. What is the business process? Yeah, it's well, the argument is that it's a kind of what's the term? Locavore. It is a kind of locavore culture, that the houses are positioned in proximity to the market, and we attempted to map that distribution and sales, but that you require different kinds of friends than we have in order to be able to do this, and we couldn't really get that, but speaking to people who run operations, most of the sales are within Los Angeles. And of course, a lot of the sales go to medical marijuana outlets now. But surprisingly, that's not what rules the economy of the grow house operation. Even though they work as local stabilizers, the money leaves the country. Almost 90% of the operations are now owned by various what to call them, Asian business interests, and so it's really understood that you're a kind of employee of a corporation when you run one of these houses, and much like working for other kind of semi-legal and illegal agencies, your legal fees are paid for, and your excuses are provided by lawyers, etc., etc. And so it's a front operation at many levels, right? And they're absolutely standardized, but this is where the kind of do-it-yourself culture of the grow house becomes interesting, because I've spared you by not presenting a lot of research on this project, but one of the ways it interests me is the way that it picks up a lot of the do-it-yourself ecological architecture culture of California in the early 70s, the discussions of the responsive house, etc., which are principally a kind of anti-architecture debate or architectural design debate, but pro-architecture transformation debate. And one of the terms that we've been using to describe the house is maintenance, right? There's a kind of culture of maintenance, maintenance being that term within the kind of Southern California drug patois, which is how you behave socially even though you are stoned. And so the house has to maintain, in that sense, right? It has to appear normal and normative and to be functioning normally while it has a kind of deeply disturbed interior. But fundamentally, it's space of do-it-yourself culture where various nutrients and various hydroponic techniques are perfected, and there's an intense competition among these techniques. And so even though it's a kind of business operation, there is a kind of, in the same way, a kind of like car culture in Southern California, there's an intense pride in the customization of the system. Yeah, that's you have to have a remarkable degree of organization to make this covert. That's true, which is to say that the warfare between detection and concealment has all kinds of loopholes in it, right? And which is why part of what we're interested in is the staging of this warfare and the use of. We understand it as a kind of complex orchestration of forms of representation more than we really see it as a serious attempt to shut down the operations, right? Almost in every way, the images are compensatory in some regard. Well, yeah. So to try to answer that, obviously the question of criminality in architecture is closely related to type and typology, and character and criminality is through typology. And so it would seem obvious that this discussion would also focus on that relationship between type and criminality. But it seems, just to repeat what you've already picked up on, most of the procedures bypass that question. And so for us to return it to, how to put it, the kind of criminalizing of the architecture, which is, really what's at work, would require a more careful attention to the bypass type, let's say. And so this is part of what we're trying to do, is to collect an encyclopedia not only of the images, but of the types which lend themselves most obviously to the grow house operation. And so there is a whole argument about not only the repression of this interior in terms of its public performance, but the repression of the typological criminalized relationship that we're starting to try to work out with this encyclopedia. And so I can't say much more about that, but to say that we're going to try to expose the kind of repression of type, let's say. But the question of criminality, of course, like most of this project, it's a self-consciously and avowedly adolescent project. Right? That's part of the pleasure, is that it's a project about marijuana and pot houses, right? And there could be at some level nothing more trivial, but at another level, what interests us is not so much the criminalization of the house, but the criminalization of the excessive energy expenditure, right? And this is what we were saying about energy privacy. And this is really where the interesting legal debates are being played out. is what happens to not the image of let's say a kind of marijuana interior, but the emanating image of an excessive and abundant expenditure of energy, and how does that enter public and legal and forensic discourse. And that's part of where the research is going, and it's also going toward as we've stated, the kind of overlap between the green and sustainable use of these technologies and ones that operate within the grow house culture, right? The complete and perfect cross-registration of the sustainable use of thermographic imaging, and let's call it the criminal, the use of thermographic imaging within the kind of criminal debate. And for us, that elevates the question of what we call the deeper shade of green, right? The kind of sustainable discourse and its representational techniques into a whole other field of discussion and discourse. So, Mark. Yeah. No, one of the drawings I didn't show, and this is important, is that no, because of course you can just scan any type of database, and you would immediately see the overconsumption of energy, and you'd be able to pinpoint these operations. So all of the energy is stolen in these operations, and there are various techniques for how you steal energy from the grid, and some of them, quite sophisticated. And so the energy expenditure never shows up within the database. Other types of information show up within the database, and this is why the heat signature becomes important. It's one of the only techniques, arguably, for understanding. You get the output, but not the input, exactly. No, you're absolutely right. The legal debate is whether this is an invasive form of imaging or not. And so this is why the question of emanation becomes fundamentally important. And this is how the courts argued that it's an emanation of energy, and that emanation becomes public as soon as it exits the house. And so it's a question, this is why we termed it information leakage. There's a whole system of trying to collect the information that leaks out of the house. And the thermographic image and the heat signature would just be one form of that information leakage. But you're entirely right. If it could be shown that the image was somehow actually an image of the interior, then it would not be allowed legally. Right? And so the question of what it shows is at debate. Right? And so this is why we think of it in terms of kind of spectral imagery from the 19th century. Right? It's not exactly the interior, it's something else. It's a quality of the interior or some kind of character attached to the interior. It's not actually the interior itself. It's a kind of energy field of the interior. And so if you're thinking of a kind of theorist to help you describe the image production, you wouldn't probably look to Benjamin or any other image of reproduction. You would probably look to somebody like Alan Watts. Do you know who Alan Watts is? New Age theorist, most famous for the Tao of philosophy. And hold on, do I have Alan Watts with me? I never go far without my Alan Watts these days. But this would be a claim he would make. This is what Alan Watts says. Really, the fundamental ultimate mystery, the only thing you need to know to understand the deepest metaphysical secrets is this, that for every outside there is an inside, and for every inside there is an outside, and although they are different, they go together. And so, obviously the kind of adolescent fixation continues through people like Alan Watts, but as this project develops, that's how we're trying to position it, is the kind of spectral imagery, not only, let's say, figured around 19th century problems of representation, but also around New Age problems of representation and this whole conceit of a kind of exposed interiority. And, which is actually the logic that the Bureau House operators occupy, not the most recent business, large business operations, but the kind of homegrown California entrepreneurs, right? It's an emphatically a New Age discipline. Great. Daniel. I mean, do these operations hide in the confusion among the various agencies? Yeah, I wish I could answer that more clearly, because we encountered such remarkable opacity among the various law enforcement agencies, and it was only through various newspaper journalists who had connections in various agencies that we made any connection at all. The Drug Enforcement Agency claims jurisdiction over everything, but whether they actually perform operations everywhere, I don't know. It seems that they don't, right? It seems that they stage these in order to put them on their website every couple of months, but they're not actually involved in any ground level recon. I think that falls to the very local agencies, and not the LAPD, but the local counties. But I suspect you're right if what you're asking is there a kind of bureaucratic confusion that you can hide within. I think yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, the hydroponic system has a constant circulation of water, as you can imagine, and I think it depends on the sophistication of the operation. Some operations have built-in very sophisticated scrubbing techniques that clean the water and allow them to use it again and again, and so they have a kind of internal hydrology at work, but others, yeah, less sophisticated, draw heavily. And any time you connect to the local infrastructure, it's a point of vulnerability. Right, and so, yeah. Who designs them? The authorship is hard to ascertain in this case. Anybody who designs them and owns them is not advertising. But there are all kinds of anonymous authors that are made available on various websites. It doesn't take a lot of research to find websites of people who are all too eager to explain the benefits of their own grow house design. I'm sorry? I've not encountered an architect or an engineer who has confessed, but that's not to say it doesn't happen. And as an architect being involved in this project, it seems like a natural outcome would be to design a grow house. And this is probably at some point we will do this, because it is a kind of architecturally fascinating object, and all kinds of improvements and modifications become apparent immediately. So if you noticed anything that requires your design help, feel free to volunteer. Yeah. Well, we don't have yet, we don't have conclusive evidence, let's say, but the surprise was that the house is actually more, the grow house op is more adaptable than you would imagine. The prevalence is the house that we've shown. This is a kind of composite house based on the arrests that we've seen, right? Which is a large single-story house, well-distributed kind of neo-mission style exterior, but depending on the development, they can appear anywhere. We found grow ops that occurred in double-story and triple-story houses, and in the same way that you have a kind of Gordon Matta Clark interior, right? The kind of completely demolished interior, which is then reconfigured planimetrically. This happens in section in the 2- and 3-story houses as well, right? Where you build a kind of complex sectioned factory within that volume. And so we, you know, as I said, we're in the middle of this. We don't have an answer yet, but more varied than you would expect. Flexible, absolutely, yes, a flexible system. Right, great, thank you very much. Yeah, we have about all of these projects in LA downstairs that we're trying to turn into.
Oh, really? Yeah. So this is one installment, basically.
Yeah, this is one installment, and this one is the most kind of